So, for all those who are joining today, thank you for joining us. We are going to talk through the development of the 24-27 Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. We have a number of folks from ODOT, our senior members of our team that helps develop the STIP and bring that conversation forward to the Oregon Transportation Commission. So we will be walking through this. And then if we have external partners who have joined, we will be able to answer questions and have any dialogue that may be necessary here. So I'm going to start out and walk through the beginning of the program and talk through the basic outline of what the STIP is and how we are going to go about developing it before turning it over to others within ODOT to cover additional topics. The STIP is obviously very important as it is our capital transportation program for the state, and it includes over $2 billion in transportation project expenditures. So we want to ensure that there is wide opportunities for the public and our stakeholders to weigh in and participate in and engage in development of the STIP, because we want to make sure that the STIP reflects the needs and priorities of Oregonians and that we're building the transportation system that the state needs. So let's talk a little bit about STIP funding and development. First off, people sometimes ask us what the STIP is, and it's important to note that it's the capital program funds used for construction programs generally that are federal and state funds that are dedicated to these types of programs. It doesn't include many of ODOT's state-funded multimodal grant programs, whether that is the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund for Transit or the Connect Oregon program. It also doesn't include maintaining and operating the system, especially our ODOT maintenance forces, nor does it include many of the ODOT revenue or program or administrative functions. So it's really focused on that capital construction program that is so vital to maintaining and preserving the transportation system and improving it over time as well. One of the most important elements of the STIP is the federal funding that comes into the STIP from the Federal Highway Administration and also from the Federal Transit Administration. Every time we begin a STIP, we work with the Oregon Transportation Commission, which really plays an incredibly pivotal role in all of this, in developing the STIP and approving the STIP and providing direction to ODOT throughout this entire process. So the Oregon Transportation Commission's first action that they have undertaken as we have begun the STIP development process is to make some assumptions about how much federal funding is available in the STIP. The challenge is that the FAST Act, which is our current Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, expires in about 7 weeks. And we are talking about directing funding to programs 7 years into the future. And so as a result, as you can imagine, it's challenging for us to know how much federal funding we're going to have 7 years from now, when we don't even know how much federal funding we're going to have 7 weeks from now when that FAST Act expires. As a result, the commission has had to make some assumptions. And what they have done is assumed, as they have in the past, that in the future, we might see a reduction in federal funding of about 10%. This is consistent with what we've seen in the past when the Federal Surface Transportation Authorization Act has expired, and also gives us a reasonable and prudent way of mitigating some of the risk that comes with this uncertainty at the federal level. So if federal funding comes in over and above the amount that they've assumed, the commission will give us some direction in this next step process and help provide that direction as to where any additional money will be spent. So the STIP is really a combination of federal and state funds. It's about 2/3 federal, 1/3 state. The total funding in this 24 through 27 STIP is about $2.2 billion. And it's interesting to note this is actually a little bit less than we had in the previous STIP. And that's primarily because the funding under House Bill 2017, the Major Transportation Funding Investment Package, that was approved by the legislature in 2017, actually front-loaded a lot of funding in dedicated projects. These were the projects that were specifically named in the bill by the legislature. So in the 21 through 24 STIP, there was over $600 million in these projects that were included in the STIP. In this 24 through 27 STIP, we're going to have a lot fewer of those projects because most of those projects will be completed by then. Instead, what we'll see is there's a gradual phase in of additional money that will be going primarily to fix-it programs. But you can see that as a result of the way that the package phases in and that upfront investment of bonded funds in those named dedicated projects, that we're actually going to have a little bit less money coming from the state level in this STIP than we did in the past. There are 3 stages to the work that the Commission does around the STIP. The first is around funding allocation. That work is going to take place in 2020. This is where we have the Commission make determinations on what categories will be funded in the STIP and what programs within those categories will be funded, how much will go to each, and also make some determinations and decisions about how those programs will work in terms of eligibility or criteria or other things. The second aspect of this program is really the project selection process, which takes place in 2021 and 2022. When we send our teams out on the ground, they do scoping of projects, they do work using our data systems and management systems to determine the condition of the system and where the highest priority projects are given our investment criteria and strategies. After that work has been done, we have conversations with our local communities, in particular with our advisory committees and our area commissions on transportation. Before generally we have those project lists approved. And after that, then the Commission moves into that public review and the final approval process for the STIP in 2023. This is when the Commission will receive the draft STIP, take that out for public review and comment, and then take those comments, review those and approve that STIP and send it on to the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration for their review and approval, which will take place toward the end of 2023. So as you can see, this is a very long 3-year process. And throughout this process, we're going to include public review and comment as a way to ensure that we're listening to the public and investing the resources in the system in a way that matches the need and the public's interest in the transportation system. So what we're here to talk about today really is that funding allocation process that will take place through the rest of the year. We already had one meeting with the Commission in July. They sat down, we gave them a briefing about the process and got them to agree on the funding categories that will be used as a starting place for this STIP cycle. In August through November, we will be having conversations with the Commission that will help us develop and review and analyze funding scenarios. That will be an opportunity for the Commission to be able to weigh in where they see the need for investments, whether that is in various of the categories or specific programs. And then our hope is that in December that the Commission will be able to approve a funding scenario as the final allocation of funds in the STIP. Throughout this, we expect to have significant public and stakeholder engagement in the process. We are going out and meeting with our various advisory committees, the ACTs, the modal advisory committees across the state, talking with the metropolitan planning organizations as well. We're also holding this webinar as a way to be able to reach out to those folks who may not be able to make it to those meetings. We know that with COVID, everything is going virtual, and that virtual meetings are not always as conducive to robust dialogue. So we want to make sure that we're giving people an opportunity to learn about the STIP and then provide their feedback. So one of those mechanisms we're using is we put together a survey that specifically went to our advisory committee members that allows them to weigh in on some questions that we're going to lay out at the very end of this presentation. We're also going to be providing monthly public updates throughout this so that people can see the progress as this works its way through the work of the Commission. We've also put out a public survey for any member of the public to be able to weigh in on spending priorities. Both of these surveys are going to close at the end of this month, and then we're going to gather that information, present that to the Oregon Transportation Commission in September so that they have that basic data from the public engagement, the comments from advisory committees, so that they can start understanding where the public is and using that as we go forward to develop these funding scenarios. We are also expecting that we will likely have an online open house at some point during the funding scenario discussion so that people can weigh in about which different scenarios they find most compelling. And of course, there's ongoing public comment opportunities for people to weigh in writing to the Oregon Transportation Commission about the STIP. To do that, you can go to their website. They have a comment form. You can also mail in or email in a letter on either the questions that we are posing or any other topic related to the STIP. So we really do value that public comment. I am going to turn it over to Amanda Peets now, who will talk us through one of the newest features that is going to play a prominent role in the STIP, and that's really about how we're going to be applying a climate lens to decisions in the STIP throughout the entirety of that process as we go through.
Great, thank you, Travis. So, my name is Amanda Peets, and I'm the director of ODOT Climate Office. I'm hearing a lot of feedback on my end. So we're applying a climate lens to the STIP decisions from here moving forward. Part of why we're doing that is that the governor released Executive Order 2004, which requires the agency to consider greenhouse gas impacts of various project decisions within the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. So similar to Travis talking about the 3 phases of the STIP development, we have 3 stages of applying the climate lens to our decisions. The first stage comes into play as we consider the different program allocations. So how much money goes into fixing our roadways and our bridges, how much money goes into our multimodal, biking, walking, public transportation investments, and safety investments. And so as the commission considers how much money goes into each of those buckets of funding, we'll be providing information on the relative impact of those investments to greenhouse gas emissions. So will those suite of investments, are they likely to increase emissions, decrease emissions, or keep them pretty flat? We will also be looking at impacts to adaptation. So are we building a more resilient transportation system that will stand more flooding, more landslides, sea level rise, and some other issues related to the climate. So on the first stage shown on this slide, we're looking at developing a kind of consumer report to show relative directionality of different types of investments, not only to climate outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation, but also to other important priorities and objectives that the commission must consider and balance, such as safety, equity, and mobility. In the second stage of analysis, we'll look at projects. So we will be considering how individual projects might increase or decrease emissions. So for example, a bridge replacement that puts a bridge back in the same location for greenhouse gas emissions may be neutral, may not increase or decrease emissions, but may address some issues related to scour or impacts related to climate change, so may be good for adaptation. However, if a bridge replacement goes in, but it's adding capacity, adding a lane or 2, that may be negative for greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to associate different project types with increasing or decreasing emissions, but other impacts as well, to inform the selection of projects. A question I often get on this is, what does that mean for the projects that are selected? So we are looking across programmatically and trying to influence the suite of investments that we make. So by the end of the day, of the investments the Department of Transportation makes as part of its STIP and as part of its other major project decisions, we're going to try to reduce emissions overall. That doesn't mean that an individual project that may increase emissions may not go through. That project may go through for other reasons. For example, a project that adds a turn lane may be included because it addresses a significant safety need. But as a whole, that should be mitigated and balanced with other projects that reduce emissions. So as a whole, we're trying to move that direction towards reducing our climate impacts on the transportation system. The third stage of analysis is really an accounting in the end. So once the draft STIP is developed, that phase 3 that Travis showed earlier, we will be accounting for how much emissions will that result in likely into the future. Our requirement is to develop a methodology by June of 2021. However, as we're talking about the timelines here, we're making decisions on the 24 through 27 STIP now. So we want to make sure we're influencing those decisions now. So we're trying some new processes. We'll have to iterate those over time, and they won't be perfect, but at least we're providing more information to help really put that climate lens onto our major investment decisions. Travis, back to you. And Travis, you're on mute.
Thanks, Amanda. Can you hear me now? All right, sorry about that. Now we will turn it over to Mac Lind, our Deputy Delivery and Operations Division Administrator. He is going to start off and walk us through some of the STIP program categories. Some of this you'll see today is a preview of what the Oregon Transportation Commission is going to get this week as we bring our second conversation to them, which will be beginning to work on the funding and program briefing piece of the STIP, but also beginning the work of getting feedback on how to construct the scenarios. So Mac, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Travis. Thank you once again, Mac Lind, Deputy Administrator for Delivery and Operations. So I want to touch briefly on what Travis was just mentioning. So the program categories, Oregon Transportation Commission last month affirmed these 6 categories continuing to move forward in this next STIP cycle. Generally the same categories we had in the last STIP, the 21 through 24 STIP. What this really does is it helps not only the commission, but more importantly, the department, as well as all of our stakeholders that may be watching this, think about where do we invest? Where do we invest the funding that we have in the state into priority areas for the transportation system, and helping to, quote unquote, put some big rocks. How do we fill out some big rocks in this process? What are those big categories that we're talking about? There's a whole host of programs under each one of these areas or categories, but this just helps us kind of frame up the conversation. And as Amanda Peets was mentioning earlier, we have that new added element of climate, and how does that climate lens fit across all of these categories and the programs and the projects that are selected within that. So the Commission recently affirmed these 6 categories moving forward, and we are now beginning the work to determine how much money, if you will, should go to each. So just briefly run through these. I will go in a little more depth here in a second on a couple, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Flowers in a second to walk through a couple others. But starting at the top, our Enhanced Highway Program, really around expanding or enhancing the transportation system, those historically highway-centered projects, on-the-road projects, really on the state system. Fix It, that's our bread and butter. That's our bridges, our pavements. It's how do we maintain or preserve the system that we have. Safety, obviously a huge priority for this state. Projects focused on reducing fatals and serious injuries on all Oregon roads. So this is one that we certainly have cities, counties, and ODOT facilities involved in that investment structure. Non-highway really represents the other part of our multimodal transportation system, including transit, bicycle and pedestrian, access to transit, et cetera, our active transportation programs, if you will. Local programs, we certainly help facilitate a tremendous amount of funding towards our local partners, cities, counties, MPOs, et cetera. And a large portion of these funds are able to fund exchange and use state funds instead of federal funds. We also have our significant program known as the Local Bridge Program in this category. And then lastly, you got to have a category that just kind of catches the stuff that doesn't fit other places. That's our other functions category. Capturing a few of those other things that we can use federal funding for, like workforce development, planning, data collection, and some of our administrative costs. How do we capture some of those costs and uses of those federal funds? Next slide, please. So for a historical perspective, here's how this laid out in the current STIP, or the STIP that we're just approving right now, as a matter of fact, the 2021-2024 STIP. It's important to recognize this was approved. This funding allocation was approved 3 years ago, about the same time that House Bill 2017 was passed. And that really influenced the conversation with the Oregon Transportation Commission several years ago. And you can see for the first time a significant investment in state funds in the STIP. And that's shown here as House Bill 2017 on the chart. You can see a significant amount in that enhanced category. That's what Travis mentioned earlier around those designated or earmarked projects. There was a significant amount of money set aside for safety, for some of the non-highway investments like safe routes to school, and then of course in the Fix-It program, which I'll speak to in a minute. But it gives you a flavor for how big the portfolio is and how much is dedicated or how much is allocated to each category area by the OTC. This is the thing that the OTC will be making their next decision on, is how much of this funding should be distributed amongst these areas. It's always important, I think, to recognize there's a finite amount of funding. And so as you move one of these columns up, another column is going to have to come down. So how do you balance the trade-offs from a policy perspective of what we're trying to accomplish with the flexibility we have with the federal fundings or now with House Bill 2017 funding? So it's important to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So Fix-It's our largest category. As I mentioned earlier, this is our bread and butter. This is primarily funded with federal funds, but we now have a significant amount of money coming in from House Bill 2017, especially in this STIP cycle where a lot of earmarked or named projects will be delivered or already funded, so increasing the amount of money going towards those Fix-It categories. A lot of this is driving the work that we do on the system, bridges and pavements mainly, but certainly a bread and butter of our program. Next slide, I'll show you a little bit more in depth. The way we think about programs within that Fix-It category. Pavements and bridges, like I continue to mention, are our biggest, about $100 million a year-ish in both of those program areas. A significant investment, certainly for the economy of the state, the accessibility and the usability of the system and reliability. Seismic is a new funding mechanism that House Bill 2017 created to further our efforts to have a seismic resilient system, or at least priority corridors that are prepared for that seismic event. Culverts continue to be a challenging area for us. It's a known problem. It's quote unquote hidden, if you will. And then operations funds, just a whole host of improvements on the system, from things like sign replacements, upgrading signals, dealing with rock slides, as Amanda mentioned earlier in her presentation, to a couple other areas that really help keep the system moving and operating efficiently and effectively. Go to the next slide, please. Enhance is an area or category that we've had for a couple STIP cycles. For those of you that may have been around for a few years now, we had an enhanced program 2 or 3 cycles ago now that really put the non-highway and the highway funds all together. The ACTs and the advisory committees came together to help evaluate and recommend which projects to fund. Really a competitively driven program, if you will. In the last STIP cycle, we narrowed that down to just enhance highway investments, so just those investments on the state highway system, and created that non-highway category. And last time around, because of that significant investment in House Bill 2017, for a lot of projects on the state and local system that really expanded or enhanced the system, the OTC dedicated about $24 million a year, or excuse me, $24 million in last STIP cycle to help leverage Fix-It projects to make enhancement or expansion opportunities available, really a leveraging opportunity. That's a major shift, I think, from what our stakeholders probably appreciated in the previous STIP cycle of having that competitively driven program, which is the OTC certainly had a lot of debate around the increased amount of funding that House Bill 2017 brought for those types of projects. As we move into this next 24-27 STIP, I suspect this will be another challenging conversation at the commission level of how to balance the amount of funding available for this enhanced category amongst the other categories of needs within the STIP. So certainly one that we internally are paying attention to and heavily engaged in. I'm sure folks on this call or watching this later are also very interested in as well. Next slide, please. This is the last area I want to touch on, which is safety. And we pulled this out specifically just given the focus on safety in this state and because of the way that we distribute the funding between cities, counties, and ODOT facilities. We're really about a data-driven approach to reduce fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads, regardless of jurisdiction. It's called our All Roads Transportation Safety Program, a jurisdictionally blind program to fund those most cost-effective improvements on the system and really make the most bang for the buck, if you will, for improving safety for Oregon, not just for jurisdictions. It's a significant amount of money provided by the federal highway funds dedicated towards safety improvements, and House Bill 2017 also dedicated an additional $10 million per year for safety projects on state highways. So we leverage that All Roads Transportation Safety Program for that as well. We also have included our rail highway crossing safety funds in this category as well. So a significant category of investments, certainly one that I think all Oregonians care deeply about, as we do as well as the department. So another big category. So those are three big categories I just ran through: fix it, enhance highway, and safety. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Flowers next, who will walk through the other two major categories within the STIP. Jeff?
Can everybody hear me? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so the next category is our local government program. This is the money that is provided to our local governments through the federal fund process. But before I jump into the federal funds, Oregon has traditionally been very generous to our local governments. Our local governments receive nearly half of our state highway fund apportionments and another third coming from our federal funds, approximately. So as I walk through all of this, I kind of want to just describe them at a high level for you. Each of these little spots, the big one is our local bridge program. That is our, through our AOC LOC agreement, provides money directly to competitive process with our local bridges to be able to get those up to speed and up to date. You have the STBG for cities and counties. This is our AOC LOC agreement as well. This provides allocation-based processes based on population and a few other elements in the math to be able to provide cities and counties and our small NPOs with a portion of our STBG funds that ODOT receives annually outside of the TMA areas. IOF is a business development program that we have in cooperation with Business Oregon. TGM is a transportation growth management. Our LTAP program is our local technology. Our STBG, the TMAs, that is the federally funded process, which by rule has to go through to the TMAs, which is Portland, Salem, and Eugene. They also receive TAP funds, and then also the NPO planning funds, which is federally required planning dollars that are required to go to the, in this state, 10 NPOs. And then there is CMAQ, which is congestion management, air quality. And that money is basically 93% of that, those dollars go to our non-attainment areas in the state and are formula-based as well, with a couple of our small entities out in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon that receive a little bit of funds from that map as well. And moving on to the next slide, please, Travis. This slide just provides a little bit of a context setting as to who and what and where all of the funding and the program levels are set to. So for example, CMAQ, Congress is the one that sets forth the CMAQ allocations, and who selects the projects, the recipients that receive those allocations through the math and the agreements that we already have in place. Same with the STPG, TAP, and PL funds for the NPOs. The NPOs decide where that goes. Local Bridge has a local bridge committee, which is made up of ODOT and local bridge stakeholders, and that goes through that, so forth and so forth, to kind of describe all of this. This is one of our bigger programs, and it's been very successful through our local bridge program and our STBG, the cities and counties, which most of our cities and counties fund exchange, and are able to provide a lot of flexibility for them to be able to provide maintenance, chip seal projects, and little quick hit jobs that the locals are able to go do on their own behalf after they've exchanged the funds for state dollars. So, and then at the bottom, as Mac was just talking about, was our ARTS program, which is the safety program or all roads transportation safety. And Congress also sets that one, but it goes through a selection process based on the various criteria, but jurisdictionally blind to be able to provide that to you. And each of the regions receive a share of that to be able to help provide that. Next slide. And I think, Travis, you were going to take this one, or I can jump in and take it too.
I'd be happy to take this one, Jeff. So our non-highway programs are funded through a combination of funds that include some directed federal funds as well as some flexible FHWA funds that can be spent on highway or non-highway purposes, as well as some state highway fund dollars. It's really important to remember that when we talk about the state highway fund, those dollars can only be spent within the road right-of-way. So that includes bicycle and pedestrian, road, and some transit projects that are within the road right-of-way. The federal funds, though, can be spent both inside and outside the right-of-way and on public transportation. So we oftentimes rely on those federal flexible funds to fund some of the things that we can't do with the state highway fund. There are a number of mandatory programs within those federal and state categories, whether that's the Safe Routes to School infrastructure program that was created by HB 2017, the 1% set aside for a bicycle and pedestrian that was created by the Oregon Bike Bill about 50 years ago, as well as some federal programs like recreational trails and the Transportation Alternatives Program. It's really important to note that the OTC has significant discretion to direct this non-highway funding to various priority investments. And they also have the authority to redirect additional federal funds to these programs if they so choose. This is an example of the way the OTC directed the funding in the 21 through 24 STIP, showing how it was broken down through a variety of categories. What's really important to note here, though, is that this is a category that changes from STIP to STIP to a significant extent, depending on the Commission's investment priorities in these non-highway areas. And I would expect that this would change somewhat as the Commission may choose to change up the way that these investments are made, whether that's finding different ways to invest funds in the bicycle pedestrian network or different priorities for transit. They created an active transportation leverage program in the last STIP that was to add active transportation and transit features to our Fix-It and other types of projects. We don't know whether they'll choose to continue that in the future, but just this is illustrative of how this funding has been distributed in the past, but it's not necessarily indicative of how it would be distributed in the future. So I am going to now turn it over to Jerry Bohard, our Policy Data and Analysis Division Administrator, who will walk you through the way we are going to take the next steps in developing the STIP and some of the considerations as we begin working through scenarios.
Okay. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me all right. I'm Jerry Bohard, and I think I'm batting cleanup. It's a short way of what Travis walked through. So, one of the first things you heard Amanda talk about sort of the climate work that she's doing, and that's new to this STIP. The other thing that's new to this STIP is our strategic action plan priorities. So even though the Commission obviously pays attention to the policies within the Oregon Transportation Plan, the Oregon Highway Plan, and all of our modal plans, they've also added additional sort of priorities that will guide this STIP. So one is around equity, so prioritizing diversity and equity and inclusion, as you can see identified here. The modern transportation system, so really about, building and maintaining and operating a modern transportation system that serves all Oregonians. And then finally, just recognizing the need for funding, so making sure that we seek sufficient and reliable funding to support our transportation system. So again, these will help to form how the Commission guides the STIP process. So, for example, in the next slide, thank you, Travis. As I mentioned earlier, in this STIP, a lot has changed from the previous STIP. So we have a greater focus on climate, and we have the creation of these priorities. And here you can see the goals that are under the modern transportation system. So we do have goals under the other 3 priorities, but obviously these are the ones that will definitely guide as the commission thinks about the program levels for the STIP. This will also help, I think, to frame, as we mentioned earlier, our scenarios that we bring forward to see how they align with the priorities that have been identified here. I think one of the things that will be really interesting about these scenarios, different than what we did in the past, was in order to really understand the impact that they will have, you're going to see us showing a larger shift from scenario to scenario. So for instance, in the past, we often looked at what would it take to fix it from 80% of the funds to 85% of the funds. That didn't necessarily show the impact. In this case, we're going to be looking at sort of, as you can see here, the status quo versus what we call option 1 and option 2, when we're really trying to show a greater difference between each of the programs categories that had been identified earlier in the conversation. And then we envisioned something like what you see on the right, sort of like that consumer report about what the impact will be, whether you're talking about mobility, accessibility, all the priorities that have been identified within the strategic action plan. So, I think with that, because we don't know what those are going to look like yet, I guess I would say that's the conversation we're going to have with the commission just later on this week to help us frame what these scenarios are going to look like. We will start having the conversation with the commission on scenarios in September and bringing back to them some additional scenarios in October. So that really is what's important in the next slide. When we come back to the commission in September, we will have heard from them, like I said, this week, a little bit about how we should frame our scenarios. We have heard from you all from the survey that you've done, what any comment sheets that you might submitted. Those will help us to inform the commission discussion in September. And you can see here, these are really the questions that we want you to be thinking about and providing comments to us. What are the highest priority transportation needs? And how should the commission allocate funds across those modes? So in some of the pie charts that you saw, right, between even parts of the fix-it categories versus what's in non-highway. How should we target some of our non-highway spending to address statewide goals and needs? So again, I think we also recognize around equity that we need to provide funds across the state, but we also want to make sure that we're fulfilling the needs of the modes as well. And I think, and you've heard this sort of reiterated time and time again, the size of our pie is not changing. So if we add to a slice somewhere, we're going to have to take a slice out somewhere else. So we'll be looking for you guys to provide comments that if you see areas where you'd like to see additional spending, why you think there should be less spending in another area. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Travis.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. And I am going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. I have to say I love these webinars that are always fun, especially my teenage daughter decided it would be really helpful to walk in the room behind me. So Mac and I were comparing stories, and he usually has 2-year-olds and 6-year-olds screaming in the background. So my apologies for what may appear to be a less than 100% professional webinar. It's sort of the nature of the beast of COVID-19 working from home. So I am going to look through the questions now and take a look and see if we can answer some of those. So I see a question about the slide deck being available after the meeting. So yes, we would be happy to make this available after the meeting. The goal for this was we were going to post this online and then be able to share that with members of our advisory committees. We recognize that probably not very many people would be able to actually attend this, but wanted to make sure that this information was available for those who wanted to get it and weren't able to attend one of the advisory committee meetings. So we will make sure that we do that, and then we'll share that out into the world as well. So I see a question from Rob Interfeld from the city of Eugene about, could there be consideration of bringing back the STIP Enhance program, which was in the 2 previous STIPs? And so I'll take a crack at that as well. So Rob also notes that perhaps STIP Enhance could be part of one scenario. And if no STIP Enhance, what was this grant program replaced with? So a number of questions related to that specific topic. So in the 2015 to 2018 STIP, there was a broad multimodal category of funding where ODOT lumped together a number of funding categories that were made available and broadly provided for the state system or the local system in order to select the best projects across a variety of modes. In that STIP, I think it was something north of about $200 million was distributed through that mechanism. In the STIP after that, we took a slightly different approach in the 2018 to 2021 STIP, and I believe we had an enhanced non-highway program that allowed for people, local governments, and for ODOT and others to apply for the non-highway type projects. For whatever reason, the commission did not go in that direction in the 21 through 24 STIP. So certainly that would be an option to amalgamate some of those funding sources and provide that broad opportunity. There has been some work within our public transportation division to be able to combine different programs together. We have a community path program now that has combined a number of funding sources and that allows for that. So we're very interested in exploring that concept of combining funding sources and trying to make the funding available to the best projects rather than having trying to fit or to select the best projects within a very narrow funding source. Jerry, is there anything you might want to add, or Mac, to that?
So I think the key one was the community paths is going to be our bicycle program. So the bicycle excise tax, the money that the commission had set aside for bike. So we were bringing all that money together. So we had a nice size bucket of money. Safe routes to school. So I think that those ended up being sort of separate grant programs which local governments can apply for. And then we've done the active transportation that have been the linkages to our Fix-It. So the place that has changed is that sort of local highway improvements. There's not a program like that, and there hasn't been for the last step. So.
Great. Anything, Mac, you want to add to that?
Question that the commission wrestled with last time was the impact to those other category areas by creating a different program that maybe felt like the enhanced program of 2015 or 2018. What's the trade-off or impact to some of the other areas like safety or Fix-It? I think that's going to be that's going to be front and center as the commission considers a program like that or any other program increases or new programs in this next step. Is what's the trade-off to some of those other existing or other priority areas. So it'll be an interesting thing to follow for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mac. So there's a question from Stan Privozich from Yamhill County about two of the major areas in Yamhill County, the Newburgh-Dundee bypass and Rails to Trails. And later, Stan points out about the Rails to Trails project in North County, McMinnville to Hag Lake, and safe routes to schools from Carlton to Yamhill. The Newburgh-Dundee bypass is one that was funded primarily with a earmark from the state legislature back in the Jobs and Transportation Act, and then supplemented with some other funds in a variety of sources. So we've been able to complete phase one of that work, but phase two is still under development, under design, with right-of-way being purchased. We don't have the construction funding. So that would be a project that would rely on that enhanced highway program that Mac mentioned. As for the Rails to Trails and Safe Routes to School program, those are some types of projects that we have dedicated funding for from our Community Paths program. There is a recreational trails program that works out of the State Parks Department. And we have a dedicated Safe Routes to School program as well now. So there are a wide variety of funding sources with bicycle and pedestrian projects. It's actually relatively easy to fund bike ped in the sense that there are a large number of funding sources, even if in some ways it's difficult to fund bike ped projects because we often see that applicants need to go to multiple different categories of funding and programs to apply. So we're going to be working to see if there's ways that we can perhaps combine some of those and amalgamate those so that we don't have to have folks going to a wide variety of funding programs for each project. All right, there's a question from Steph Napa. Will the ACTS only be asked to provide feedback on the funding categories, or will there be opportunities later to provide feedback on project selection? That's a great question, Steph, and that's always the one that the ACTS care a lot about. What we've seen in the past is that that sort of depends on the funding structure that the commission decides. In the last round of funding, the legislature had earmarked all of the highway enhanced funding as well as the Connect Oregon program. So that was traditionally the bread and butter work that the ACTS did in weighing in on projects. So there were some opportunities for the ACTS to weigh in, but unfortunately, there were relatively limited opportunities. So we will see. We certainly always want to make sure that the ACTS have that opportunity and can help us select those highest priority projects, depending on what the commission ends up doing in terms of that program structure. Jerry, is there anything you might want to add to that answer?
No, I think you covered it.
Great. So another question, will the state be adjusting local match requirements given that localities don't have the revenue resources due to the crisis? So unfortunately, we have very limited discretion. When we have federal funding programs, there's a required match that's about 10% of the total project cost. And that is generally not something that we can negotiate. In fact, it's already lower for the state of Oregon than it is for other states, which generally have about a 20% match. So unfortunately, we recognize that it's often difficult for local governments to meet matching requirements. And we certainly work to try to find some ways to provide flexibility. But generally, those are federal requirements for match that are put in place. Jerry or Jeff, anything you might want to add there?
Well, there's still a match requirement, but they were able to reduce the match requirement for safe routes to school if it met certain criteria like Title I schools and whatnot. So the commission in that program specifically has a little bit of flexibility, but it doesn't get rid of the match, it just reduces it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a good point. Some of the programs have different match requirements, Safe Routes to School being one where the legislature set essentially a sliding scale for certain projects. And the same is the case in safety projects as well. Sometimes there's an opportunity to have a lower match or a 0% match even. I know that this has been a hardship for some local governments, particularly those, some of our smaller jurisdictions just don't have the match available to leverage those federal funds. So we try to work for solutions, but unfortunately we're not able to get out of that federal match requirement. All right, there's a question from Jan about, given a list of various projects from local acts, how do you differentiate and grade between competing county or region needs? And that's a good question, and it sometimes differs across programs. I would tell you that when we've had the Connect Oregon program in the past, which is not one of the programs in the STIP, it's really a separate program, that we take the input from the acts and the input from advisory committees, modal advisory committees and the freight advisory committee, and then we weight those and then develop a sort of a matrix score. Generally with the STIP programs, however, the programs in which the advisory committees, the acts weigh in, there is generally a regional distribution that is then sort of sub-allocated among the acts within a region as well. So a lot of times it really is a role of the act to determine the highest priority projects within that area. We then have sometimes a super act acting within a region that gets together to weigh together those various needs and pick the highest priority projects. It does depend to some degree on the program structure that the Transportation Commission determines, however. So Mac or Jerry or Jeff, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think this is Mac. I think for ACT engagement, we certainly appreciate and want stakeholder engagement on every program that we have. And to Travis, to your point, the way that we seek or create the opportunity for that engagement depends on the program. So safety is a great example of a data-driven approach, not based on just community needs, but based on where the fatals and serious injury accidents are occurring across the system and what's the cost benefit for those projects. But we want stakeholder engagement of, if we're debating between one project over the other and they both have similar cost benefit rankings, both similar statistics, if you will, they're a priority from the local community. For fix-it projects like Bridge and Prez, it's very much a management system or data-driven approach as well. So not a whole lot of room, if you will, to negotiate projects, but certainly we want stakeholder engagement on, is this the right time to do this project? Or is this the right limit? Or what else, while we're there, could we be considering, and is there an opportunity to leverage funding? So I don't want to dismiss that acts don't have a role in all the things that we do, they do. It's just different than maybe what had been expressed in the past around Connect Oregon or the Enhanced program we mentioned earlier, where their role was getting to a final formalized recommendation by region. And Travis, you mentioned the Super Act. Region 2 is a great example, having 4 area commissions on transportation. They're often challenged to come together and come up with one regionalized approach for their project feedback. So it really depends on the act you're in, the region you're in, if you will, and then what program area we're talking about. But I would strongly encourage our advisory committees, our acts, and our MPOs on this call to be engaged in the process and to help inform how we are making those decisions. Thanks.
Thanks, Mac. There's another question from Jan about what happens to unspent STIP funds. And so we have Jeff Flowers here who maybe will explain how that works with these STIP funds.
Okay, everybody still hear me okay? Perfect. So when we create these categories, so for example, I'm going to use a region fix-it as an example. So region X, pick one of the 5 regions we have, they get their sum of money for the fix-it program. As those monies move forward into the projects, the money is saved due to a variety of different reasons that can occur. That money rolls right back in. So basically what we do is we've created checkbooks, separate sub-accounts for each of the programs that exist. So as we were just talking about the off-system bike ped program, they are going to start with a brand new checkbook now that we're entering into the first year of the program over this 21-24 STIP that starts on October 1. So any money that is saved from those projects will go back to the program to be able to use for future allocation as part of the next round or next iteration of whatever that may be of the program. So basically, it's no different than what happens when we pay an employee. Employee gets their money, they pay their bills, whatever money saved goes into their personal checking account. Our programs run in the same fashion, so that way they can maximize the dollars to full extent that we provide them based on what the commission approves.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And I see at least one more question. I may have missed something along the way, but Steph Napa asks, is there a reason the acts can't weigh in on fix-it or non-highway projects? And I guess I'd note as a prelude before I turn it over to Jerry or Mac perhaps, that in the past there have been some opportunities for the acts to weigh in on fix-it projects. We do generally select those through data-driven processes using our management systems that bring in data about conditions and safety. And so they are selected based on the merit of the projects and less based on the community priorities around the state. But we have had some opportunities to at least weigh in on the 150% list, that list of the larger number of projects. So Jerry, Mac, or even Amanda, who's led some of our efforts around non-highway programs, if you have any thoughts about this one, I turn it over to you.
Well, the only thing I would say on some of the non-highway, like safe routes to school, is that the amount of funds, 10 million, even when they've done 2 years, the 18 million is a limited amount of funds. And we have a safe routes advisory committee, and they're trying to bring the statewide perspective. So I do believe that they do go out to the ACTs and ask for their input, but not necessarily from a prioritization standpoint because of the differing criteria. And again, sort of having a different focus of the statewide focus. But they usually do look for their input about some of their needs.
Great. Well, that was the last question that I see in the chat box. I want to thank you all for your participation and for posing questions to us. We're not going to have any more webinars like this, but we are going to be engaging with the various area commissions on transportation and advisory committees across the state. And of course, if you needed additional information about the STIP, we have a STIP website for the 24-27 STIP that you can Google and find that, and we will be posting information there. We also encourage you to sign up, if you haven't already, for our monthly STIP update, where we'll be putting out information on the next steps in the process, what the Transportation Commission has done, and with a preview of coming attractions. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time and participation, and we will close out this webinar. So thanks for everything today.